Puddin made Pyru what it is today. Puddin and Tam, they was, I'll be honest, they were psychopaths. All the Crip gangs in Compton knew Puddin because he put in working against all of us.
You had to be careful of that one person Puddin, man, because he had a green 69 Riviera. Ever we seen a green 69 Riviera, we would run whatever because we didn't know if that was Puddin or not.
I had went to jail for shooting this Puddin who started the blood gang. So I had a lot of on the after I shot dude, but they don't know it was self-defense because he was beating me up and he was very violent and jealous.
If you've watched Snowfall, there's a good chance Uncle Jerome was one of your favorite characters. With his gritty demeanor, raw street vibe, and unforgettable one-liners, he was easily one of the most loved characters on the show.
Teach a man how to squabble.
But here's a twist that might blow your mind. Uncle Jerome was actually inspired by a real-life figure, someone whose reputation was so infamous that he's considered one of the most dangerous men in history. Meet OG Puddin. OG Puddin wasn't just another street figure. He was the founder of the Pyru Boys, the group that later became the foundation of the Blood Alliance. If you think Uncle Jerome was tough, Puddin was on a whole different level. His reputation wasn't just based on hearsay. He earned it through actions that some would describe as downright psychopathic and decaying machine.
Puddin made Pyru what it is today. Puddin and Tam, they was, I'll be honest, they were psychopaths. And I used to see them, I said, man, there'd be some good Crips, but these some straight killers.
He was notorious for putting in work, a term that downplays just how violent and relentless he was against his enemies. His reputation alone was enough to strike fear in people's hearts. Stories about him were so wild that if someone even spotted a car resembling his, they'd scatter without hesitation. Nobody wanted to take the risk of finding out if it was really him behind the wheel.
You had to be careful of that one person Puddin, man, because he had a green 69 Riviera. Ever we seen a green 69 Riviera, we would run whatever because we didn't know if that was Puddin or not.
Now, when you think of Uncle Jerome, his afro, his mannerisms, and the way he carried himself, it's clear to see the similarities between him and OG Puddin. Both had a commanding presence that made them stand out. And just like Puddin, Uncle Jerome was around during the early days of the crack epidemic that turned LA upside down.
I need you outside. If you ain't about damn family, stay out my frame.
However, as wild as Jerome's antics were in the series, they don't even come close to the real-life chaos tied to OG Puddin. Let's break it all down. Sylvester Scott, better known as OG Puddin, was born on November 13, 1954, in Los Angeles, California. His early life began in a neighborhood located on 115th Street between Compton Avenue and Wilmington, an area just a stone's throw away from Nickerson Gardens. For those unfamiliar, Nickerson Gardens is now a known stronghold for the bounty hunter Bloods, but back in the early 1970s, it was just another part of the ever-evolving landscape of LA's gang culture. Around 1972, the Scott family relocated to Compton, where they settled in a modest single-story home on Pyru Street near Parr Avenue. It was a move that would unknowingly place Puddin at the epicenter of gang history. At that time, Compton was over 90% black and deeply affected by socioeconomic struggles that created the perfect breeding ground for gang culture. The Crips were on the rise, dividing into the East Side Crips and the West Side Crips, and later forming the Compton Crips. These factions grew in strength and started claiming different neighborhoods, using intimidation and violence to expand their territory. Street fights, or rumbles, were common back then. Initially, they were all about hand-to-hand combat, which was something Raymond Washington, one of the Crips' founders, preferred. But as tensions rose, so did the level of violence. Soon, bats, chains, and knives became standard weapons in these clashes. As the Crips grew, so did their boldness. Leaders like Raymond Washington, Tukey Williams, and Michael Conception turned their focus to Centennial High School, targeting students and recruiting followers by force. Within a short time, the Crips gained a large following, but not everyone was willing to bow down to their intimidation tactics. One day, things took a serious turn when Raymond Washington and a group of his followers decided to test their power by attacking Sylvester Scott, Puddin, and his close friend Vincent Owens. Both young men were living on Pyru Street at the time and were well respected in the neighborhood. Raymond probably thought they'd fold under pressure like others had, but that wasn't the case. Instead of backing down, Puddin and Vincent fought back with everything they had, refusing to let the Crips victimize them. That moment was a game changer. It wasn't just a simple street fight. It set off a chain of events that would forever change the gang landscape in Compton and beyond. At the end of the heated confrontation between Sylvester Scott, aka OG Puddin, Vincent Owens, and Raymond Washington's crew, someone could be heard shouting, "Don't mess with nobody from Piru Street and take that Crip dude with you." That line set the stage for something much bigger. Fueled by their refusal to be bullied and a growing need to protect their turf, Puddin made a bold move. He officially created the Piru Street Boys, claiming the area around Compton's West Piru Street, which intersected Central Avenue, just north of 136th Street, as their turf. Back then, Puddin wasn't the imposing figure most people came to fear later. In fact, people described him as a scrawny kid who liked nothing more than throwing a football around with friends. But don't let that fool you, he had a fire in him. The Piru Boys started small, and in the beginning they were loosely associated with the Crips. But as time went on, tension started bubbling under the surface. Internal conflicts arose, and Puddin realized that aligning with the Crips wasn't in their best interest. They split off and decided to carve their own path. The problem was the Crips heavily outnumbered the Piru Boys, and going against such a large established gang wasn't going to be easy. Puddin had to think bigger. He began uniting smaller black sets from areas surrounding Compton, places like Looters Park and Westside neighborhoods. These smaller groups shared the Piru Boys' disdain for Crip dominance, and under Puddin's leadership, they came together. This coalition would eventually evolve into the Bloods, a powerful alliance that changed the game in LA forever. To distinguish themselves from the Crips, the Bloods adopted the color red as their identifying mark, a move that's still iconic today, but standing out came at a cost. Being outnumbered meant that the Piru Boys and their allies had to level up fast, especially when it came to firepower. Violence was inevitable, and Puddin knew they couldn't rely on fists and knives forever. To afford the heavy artillery they needed, the Piru Boys had to step into the same game that the Crips had mastered, the drug trade. Puddin, though still a teenager, had already earned a reputation as someone you didn't want to cross. He quickly became a key player in the drug scene, not just surviving but thriving. He was more than just a hustler. He was strategic, ruthless, and determined to hold his ground. By the time he was fully established, Puddin wasn't just one of the biggest drug traffickers in Compton. He was the undisputed leader of one of the city's most violent and feared gangs.
Yeah, Puddin was, I'd say Puddin was nothing nice.
Puddin wasn't the type to stand out as a fighter. His reputation didn't come from throwing hands. It came from what he did with a gun in his hands.
But he had a fast draw with the gun. And because he's not here with us, I might say some things like, he was successful in putting some holes in some people.
Took out 5 bullets and put 1 bullet in and spin the drill, walked her to my head, right? And pulled the trigger, right? You know, it told me you can go. He did me and my homies like that. They put 1 bullet in it and pulled the trigger. Cause he talking about he was in a good mood that day. But he was a psychopath.
As the leader of the Piru Boys, Puddin set the tone for everything. He created an atmosphere of pure intimidation, and his crew followed his lead without question. Under his leadership, the Pyrus took on an aggressive stance, and Puddin's actions sparked a chain reaction that changed the game in Compton forever. In 1972, the real war in Compton began. Puddin decided he wasn't going to wait around for the Crips to make a move. He brought the fight to them. He and a small crew of Pyrus opened fire on a group of Crips, marking the start of what would become an all-out battle for control of Compton. That initial attack ended in a quadruple shooting, leaving 1 person dead and several others injured. It was a bold and bloody message that Puddin wasn't playing games, and from that moment on, he became Compton's most wanted.
Been a leader of a gang that opposed the Crips. It was like a trophy. But we had targets on their back, and the cold part about having a target on their back, youngsters, you don't even know.
Every Crip in the area wanted Puddin dead, but catching him was easier said than done. Puddin was strategic. He never stayed in one spot too long, and he constantly switched vehicles after pulling off hits. This made him incredibly hard to track, and his elusiveness only added to his mystique. Over time, Puddin's name started carrying a kind of mythical weight. People whispered stories about him, claiming he was untouchable. But Puddin wasn't just hiding out. He was on the offensive. He would venture into enemy territory, including the east side of Compton, just to prove a point. One of his most notorious targets was the infamous Red House on Pine Street. The Red House was a known Crip hangout where Tookie Williams and other big names often gathered. Puddin made it a personal mission to shoot up the Red House on multiple occasions, sending a clear message to the Crips that nowhere was safe. Puddin wasn't just gunning for anyone, though. He had a hit list. His targets were the top Crip leaders, the ones who had the most influence and power. And at the top of that list was Tookie Williams himself. Tookie wasn't just another Crip. He was a legend in his own right, known for his size, strength, and leadership. Most people wouldn't dare cross him, but Puddin wasn't most people. One day, Puddin finally got his chance. He ambushed Tookie on Almond Street, catching him off guard. Armed with a .45, Puddin opened fire. Tookie scrambled for cover, ducking behind a house to avoid the shots, but he wasn't quick enough. One of the bullets hit him in the leg, leaving him seriously injured.
I know he surprised Tookie. Surprised the heck out of Tookie. Over there on Almond Street. Shot him. Tookie didn't expect that.
The hit was a shock to everyone. Tookie was seen as untouchable, a giant in the Crip world. For someone to not only go after him but actually injure him was unheard of. But even a man as fearsome as Puddin couldn't escape loss. In 1975, his close friend Tam was offed by the Crips, and it hit him hard. Tam wasn't just another member of the crew. He was like a brother to Puddin. Losing someone so close flipped a switch in him, and what followed was a level of vengeance the streets had never seen. Puddin went into an uncontrollable frenzy. He was determined to make every Crip in Compton feel his pain. Puddin wanted to send a message. He started targeting Crips all over the city, making sure the fear of his name echoed in every corner. The hits were brutal, but also calculated. Crips were getting shot in their legs, feet, and ankles. In one incident, a bullet grazed a Crip's head so closely it knocked his cap clean off. That Crip was left hysterical, realizing just how close he'd come to death at Puddin's hands. During this rampage, Puddin wasn't just making isolated hits. Sometimes multiple Crip spots were hit on the same night, leaving the gang scrambling to figure out how to protect themselves. It got to the point where just the sight of a car that looked like Puddin's would send Crips running in every direction. They didn't wait around to see if it was him. They weren't willing to take the risk.
You had to be careful of that one person Puddin, man, because he had a green 69 Riviera. Whenever we seen a green 69 Riviera, we would run whatever because we didn't know if that was Puddin or not.
And here's the wildest part. Puddin carried out most of these missions solo. He didn't need backup because he was that confident in his skills. His precision with a gun was something else entirely. People said he could hit a target from 30 yards away like it was nothing. That level of accuracy made him even more dangerous because no one could escape his aim. If Puddin came for you, chances were he was going to hit his mark. But even someone like Puddin couldn't keep up that kind of lifestyle without consequences. Eventually, his reign of terror came to a pause when he got arrested for a R charge. Puddin was sent to prison, and for a while, the streets of Compton got a chance to breathe. But while he was locked up, Puddin didn't just sit around. Prison became his training ground. That scrawny kid who once loved to toss around a football was gone. By the time Puddin was released, he'd bulked up, becoming a muscular and even more intimidating figure. By the late 1970s, the Black Panthers were making moves in South Central, expanding their presence from Oakland and trying to recruit from the gangs in the area. They had already gained some traction in South Central, successfully uniting a few gangs under their movement. Their next big goal was to move into Compton, which was already a hotbed of gang activity. If the Panthers succeeded in uniting the gangs of Compton into one massive coalition, it would have been a game changer, not just for the gangs, but for law enforcement. The Compton Police Department saw this as a serious threat. At the time, their entire force consisted of just 130 officers, which wasn't nearly enough to control a united super gang. If the gangs in Compton banded together under the Panthers banner, it would have made maintaining order in the city nearly impossible. The situation could have gotten so out of hand that the police feared they'd have to call in the National Guard. Faced with this possibility, a few officers in the Compton PD decided to take matters into their own hands, and that's where Puddin came into the picture. Recognizing his influence over the Pyru and his power in the streets, the officers struck a secret deal with him. If Puddin and the Pyrus could keep the Black Panthers out of Compton, the police would back off his drug trade operations. Puddin agreed, and the deal worked. The Panthers were never able to gain a foothold in Compton, largely because Puddin and the Pyrus made it clear they weren't welcome. By keeping the Panthers out, he maintained control over Compton and ensured that his operation could run without disruption. But deals with the police only go so far. By 1987, Puddin's luck ran out when he was arrested for selling coke to an undercover officer. It was a major blow and he was sent to Chino State Prison to serve his time. His time in prison, however, revealed just how corrupt the system could be. In 1991, Puddin and over a dozen other drug dealers testified in a massive case against 6 narcotics officers from Los Angeles. These officers were accused of brutal tactics, including beating drug dealers, stealing money during raids, and planting coke to frame people. Puddin had his own story to tell. According to federal prosecutors, the officers had planted a plastic bag containing 118 grams of coke in Puddin's car, and then arrested him on drug charges. But that wasn't all. Puddin testified that $16,000 he had stashed in a paper bag at his mother's house mysteriously went missing after deputies searched the property. He didn't report the theft at the time because the money came from drug sales, but it was clear the officers had taken it. When Puddin got out of prison, he jumped back into life, and part of that included starting a relationship with Jewel, famously known as the First Lady of Death Row. At first, things between them were intense, full of passion and fire. Jewel was a rising star in the music world, known for her connection to Death Row Records, and Puddin was still one of the most feared and respected figures to come out of Compton. Together, they seemed like a power couple from two different worlds. But as fiery as their romance was in the beginning, it didn't take long for things to spiral out of control. Their relationship started hitting rough patches, and what was once hot and heavy turned into arguments and drama. Things reached a breaking point when, in a shocking turn of events, Jewel shot Puddin in the chest.
I had went to jail for shooting this Puddin who started the blood gang.
Jewel later claimed that it was self-defense, saying Puddin had been physically abusive and that he was jealous of her success with Death Row.
So I had a lot of on the after I shot dude, but they don't know it was self-defense because he was beating me up and he was very violent and jealous.
On the surface, it seemed like her story could add up. Puddin was a man who wasn't used to playing second fiddle to anyone, and Jewel's rising fame might have made things tense. But others close to the situation weren't so sure about Jewel's version of events. People who knew Puddin said that while he was tough and had a reputation as a dangerous figure, he wasn't known for being abusive. Instead, they believed the real issue might have been jealousy, just not the kind Jewel described. Puddin had always been a ladies' man. Even with Jewel in his life, he was constantly dealing with other women. This could have sparked jealousy and arguments on both sides, creating a powder keg that finally exploded that fateful day. Despite the drama, people who knew Puddin couldn't deny his magnetic presence. He was described as having a full afro, clean-cut looks, and an air of intelligence that made him stand out. In another life, he could have been a college graduate or even a professional. He had the brains and charm to succeed in legitimate ways, but instead he became one of the most feared and infamous criminals in Compton, a city that, at the time, was arguably the most dangerous in America. The gunshot wound he suffered during his altercation with Jewel would change the course of his life. While he survived the incident, it left lasting damage that would eventually catch up with him years later. By 2006, Puddin's health began to decline, and complications from that old wound finally took their toll. He passed away at the age of 51. Puddin's legacy is undeniable. He laid the foundation for what the Pyrus would become, turning them into one of the most notorious gangs in history and a central pillar of the Bloods Alliance.